Translated by Ian Courtenay Johnston. Read by Arthur Lane. Chapter 1. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous, verminous bug. He lay on his armor-hard back and saw, as he lifted his head up a little, his brown arched abdomen divided up into rigid bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket, just about ready to slide off completely, could hardly stay in place. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of his circumference, flickered helplessly before his eyes. What's happened to me? He thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table, on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread out, Samsa was a traveling salesman, hung the picture which he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago and set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat erect there, lifting up in the direction of the viewer a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm disappeared. Gregor's glance then turned to the window. The dreary weather, the raindrops were falling audibly down on the metal window ledge, made him quite melancholy. Why don't I keep sleeping for a little while longer and forget all this foolishness, he thought. But this was entirely impractical, for he was used to sleeping on his right side, and in his present state he couldn't get himself into this position. No matter how hard he threw himself onto his right side, he always rolled again onto his back. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes, so that he would not have to see the wriggling legs, and gave up only when he began to feel a light, dull pain in his side, which he had never felt before. Oh God, he thought, what a demanding job I've chosen, day in, day out on the road. The stresses of trade are much greater than the work going on at head office, and in addition to that, I have to deal with the problems of traveling, the worries about train connections, irregular bad food, temporary and constantly changing human relationships which never come from the heart. To hell with it all. He felt a slight itching on the top of his abdomen. He slowly pushed himself on his back closer to the bedpost so that he could lift his head more easily, found the itchy part, which was entirely covered with small white spots. He did not know what to make of them, and wanted to feel the place with a leg. But he retracted it immediately, for the contact felt like a cold shower all over him. He slid back again into his earlier position. This getting up early, he thought, makes a man quite idiotic. A man must have his sleep. Other traveling salesmen live like harem women. For instance, when I come back to the inn during the course of the morning to write up the necessary orders, these gentlemen are just sitting down to breakfast. If I were to try that with my boss, I'd be thrown out on the spot. Still, who knows whether that mightn't be really good for me. If I didn't hold back for my parents' sake, I would have quit ages ago. I would have gone to the boss and told him just what I think from the bottom of my heart. He would have fallen right off his desk. How weird it is to sit up at the desk and talk down to the employee from way up there. The boss has trouble hearing, so the employee has to step up quite close to him. Anyway, I haven't completely given up that hope yet. Once I've got together the money to pay off the parents' debt to him, that should take another 5 or 6 years, I'll do it for sure. Then I'll make the big break. In any case, right now I have to get up. My train leaves at 5 o'clock. And he looked over at the alarm clock ticking away by the chest of drawers. Good God, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were going quietly on. It was past the half hour, already nearly 1:45. Could the alarm have failed to ring? One saw from the bed that it was properly set for 4 o'clock. Certainly it had rung. Yes, but was it possible to sleep through this noise that made the furniture shake? Now it's true he'd not slept quietly, but evidently he'd slept all the more deeply. Still, what should he do now? The next train left at 7 o'clock. To catch that one, he would have to go in a mad rush. The sample collection wasn't packed up yet, and he really didn't feel particularly fresh and active. And even if he caught the train, there was no avoiding a blow-up with the boss, because the firm's errand boy would have waited for the 5 o'clock train and reported the news of his absence long ago. He was the boss's minion, without backbone or intelligence. Well then, what if he reported in sick? But that would be extremely embarrassing and suspicious, because during his 5 years' service, Gregor hadn't been sick even once. The boss would certainly come with the doctor from the health insurance company and would reproach his parents for their lazy son and cut short all objections with the insurance doctor's comments. For him, everyone was completely healthy but really lazy about work. And besides, would the doctor in this case be totally wrong? Apart from a really excessive drowsiness after the long sleep, Gregor in fact felt quite well and even had a really strong appetite. As he was thinking all this over in the greatest haste, without being able to make the decision to get out of bed, the alarm clock was indicating exactly 7:15. There was a cautious knock on the door by the head of the bed. "Gregor," a voice called. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Don't you want to be on your way?" The soft voice. Gregor was startled when he heard his voice answering. It was clearly and unmistakably his earlier voice, but in it was intermingled, as if from below, an irrepressibly painful squeaking which left the words positively distinct only in the first moment and distorted them in the reverberation, so that one didn't know if one had heard correctly. Gregor wanted to answer in detail and explain everything, but in these circumstances, he confined himself to saying, "Yes, yes, thank you, Mother. I'm getting up right away." Because of the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was not really noticeable outside, so his mother calmed down with this explanation and shuffled off. However, as a result of the short conversation, the other family members became aware of the fact that Gregor was unexpectedly still at home, and already his father was knocking on one side door, weakly, but with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called out, "what's going on?" And after a short while, he urged him on again in a deeper voice. "Gregor, Gregor." At the other side door, however, his sister knocked lightly. "Gregor, Are you all right? Do you need anything? Gregor directed answers in both directions. I'll be ready right away. He made an effort with the most careful articulation, and by inserting long pauses between the individual words to remove everything remarkable from his voice. His father turned back to his breakfast. However, the sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg you." Gregor had no intention of opening the door, but congratulated himself on his precaution, acquired from traveling, of locking all doors during the night, even at home. First, he wanted to stand up quietly and undisturbed, get dressed, above all have breakfast, and only then consider further action, for he noticed this clearly. By thinking things over in bed, he would not reach a reasonable conclusion. He remembered that he had already often felt a light pain or other in bed, perhaps the result of an awkward lying position, which later turned out to be purely imaginary when he stood up, and he was eager to see how his present fantasies would gradually dissipate. That the change in his voice was nothing other than the onset of a real chill, an occupational illness of commercial travelers. Of that he had not the slightest doubt. It was very easy to throw aside the blanket. He needed only to push himself up a little, and it fell by itself. But to continue was difficult, particularly because he was so unusually wide. He needed arms and hands to push himself upright. Instead of these, however, he had only many small limbs which were incessantly moving with very different motions and which, in addition, he was unable to control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then it was the first to extend itself, and if he finally succeeded doing with this limb what he wanted, in the meantime, all the others, as if left free, moved around in an excessively painful agitation. "But I must not stay in bed uselessly," said Gregor to himself. At first he wanted to get off the bed with the lower part of his body, but this lower part, which he incidentally had not yet looked at and which he also couldn't picture clearly, proved itself too difficult to move. The attempt went so slowly, when, having become almost frantic, he finally hurled himself forward with all his force and without thinking. He chose his direction incorrectly, and he hit the lower bedpost hard. The violent pain he felt revealed to him that the lower part of his body was at the moment probably the most sensitive. Thus, he tried to get his upper body out of the bed first and turned his head carefully toward the edge of the bed. He managed to do this easily, and in spite of its width and weight, his body mass at last slowly followed the turning of his head. But as he finally raised his head outside the bed in the open air, he became anxious about moving forward any further in this manner. For if he allowed himself eventually to fall by this process, it would take a miracle to prevent his head from getting injured. And at all costs, he must not lose consciousness right now. He preferred to remain in bed. However, after a similar effort, while he lay there again sighing as before, and once again saw his small limbs fighting one another, if anything worse than before, and didn't see any chance of imposing quiet and order on this arbitrary movement, he told himself again that he couldn't possibly remain in bed, and that it might be the most reasonable thing to sacrifice everything if there was even the slightest hope of getting himself out of bed in the process. At the same moment, however, he didn't forget to remind himself from time to time of the fact that calm, indeed the calmest reflection, might be better than the most confused decisions. At such moments, he directed his gaze as precisely as he could toward the window. But unfortunately, there was little confident cheer to be had from a glance at the morning mist, which concealed even the other side of the narrow street. "It's already 7 o'clock, he told himself at the latest striking of the alarm clock. Already 7 o'clock and still such a fog. And for a little while longer, he lay quietly with weak breathing, as if perhaps waiting for normal and natural conditions to re-emerge out of the complete stillness. But then, he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, whatever happens, I must be completely out of bed. Besides, by then someone from the office will arrive to inquire about me, because the office will open before 7 o'clock. And he made an effort then to rock his entire body length out of the bed with a uniform motion. If he let himself fall out of the bed in this way, His head, which in the course of the fall he intended to lift up sharply, would probably remain uninjured. His back seemed to be hard. Nothing would really happen to that as a result of the fall. His greatest reservation was a worry about the loud noise which the fall must create, and which presumably would arouse, if not fright, then at least concern on the other side of all the doors. However, it had to be tried.
While you're at it, here's a couple of things you can do to make life easier. This isn't essential, but if you want smooth sailing for the steel pipes to Umbala, a new road will help. If you can build the road, then you can send the convoy from the steel mill to Umbala. And another thing, the pipes south of the pumping station are damaged. If you can find the breach, patch it up. Then your sailing will be even smoother.
As Gregor was in the process of lifting himself half out of bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. He needed only to rock with a constant rhythm. It struck him how easy all this would be if someone were to come to his aid. Two strong people, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would have been quite sufficient. They would have only had to push their arms under his arched back to get him out of the bed, to bend down with their load, and then merely to exercise patience and care that he completed the flip onto the floor, where his diminutive legs would then, he hoped, acquire a purpose. Now, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, should he really call out for help? In spite of all his distress, he was unable to suppress a smile at this idea. He had already got to the point where, with a stronger rocking, he maintained his equilibrium with difficulty, and very soon he would finally have to decide, for in 5 minutes it would be 7:15. Then there was a ring at the door of the apartment. That's someone from the office, he told himself, and he almost froze while his small limbs only danced around all the faster. For one moment, everything remained still. They aren't opening, Gregor said to himself, caught up in some absurd hope. But of course then, as usual, the servant girl with her firm tread went to the door and opened it. Gregor needed to hear only the visitor's first word of greeting to recognize immediately who it was, the manager himself. Why was Gregor the only one condemned to work in a firm where at the slightest lapse someone immediately attracted the greatest suspicion? Were all the employees then collectively, one and all, scoundrels? Was there then among them no truly devoted person who, if he failed to use just a couple of hours in the morning for office work, would become abnormal from pangs of conscience and really be in no state to get out of bed? Was it really not enough to let an apprentice make inquiries, if such questioning was even necessary? Must the manager himself come? And in the process, must it be demonstrated to the entire innocent family that the investigation of this suspicious circumstance could only be entrusted to the intelligence of the manager? And more as a consequence of the excited state in which this idea put Gregor than as a result of an actual decision. He swung himself with all his might out of the bed. There was a loud thud, but not a real crash. The fall was absorbed somewhat by the carpet and, in addition, his back was more elastic than Gregor had thought. For that reason, the dull noise was not quite so conspicuous. But he had not held his head up with sufficient care and had hit it.
Oh gosh!
He turned his head, irritated and in pain, and rubbed it on the carpet. "Something has fallen in there," said the manager in the next room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine to himself whether anything similar to what was happening to him today could have also happened at some point to the manager. At least one had to concede the possibility of such a thing. However, as if to give a rough answer to this question, the manager now took a few determined steps in the next room, with a squeak of his polished boots. From the neighboring room on the right, the sister was whispering to inform Gregor. "Gregor, the manager is here." "I know," said Gregor to himself, but he did not dare make his voice loud enough so that his sister could hear. "Gregor," his father now said from the neighboring room on the left, "Mr. Manager has come and is asking why you have not left on the early train. We don't know what we should tell him. Besides, he also wants to speak to you personally, so please open the door. He will be good enough to forgive the mess in your room." In the middle of all this, the manager called out in a friendly way, "Good morning, Mr. Samsa." "He is not well," said his mother to the manager, while his father was still talking at the door. "He is not well, believe me, Mr. Manager. Otherwise, how would Gregor miss a train? The young man has nothing in his head except business. I'm almost angry that he never goes out at night. Right now he's been in the city 8 days, but he's been at home every evening. He sits there with us at the table and reads the newspaper quietly, or studies his travel schedules. It's quite a diversion for him if he busies himself with fretwork. For instance, he cut out a small frame over the course of 2 or 3 evenings. You'd be amazed how pretty it is. It's hanging right inside the room. You'll see it immediately, as soon as Gregor opens the door. Anyway, I'm happy that you're here, Mr. Manager. By ourselves, we would never have made Gregor open the door. He's so stubborn, and he's certainly not well, although he denied that this morning. I'm coming right away, said Gregor slowly and deliberately, and didn't move, so as not to lose one word of the conversation. My dear lady, I cannot explain it to myself in any other way, said the manager. I hope it is nothing serious. On the other hand, I must also say that we business people, luckily or unluckily, however one looks at it, very often simply have to overcome a slight indisposition for business reasons. So, can Mr. Manager come in to see you now? Asked his father impatiently, and knocked once again on the door. No, said Gregor. In the neighboring room on the left, a painful stillness descended. In the neighboring room on the right, the sister began to sob. Why didn't his sister go to the others? She'd probably just gotten up out of bed now and hadn't even started to get dressed yet. Then why was she crying? Because he wasn't getting up and wasn't letting the manager in. Because he was in danger of losing his position. And because then his boss would badger his parents once again with the old demands. Those were probably unnecessary worries right now. Gregor was still here and wasn't thinking at all about abandoning his family. At the moment, he was lying right there on the carpet, and no one who knew about his condition would have seriously demanded that he let the manager in. But Gregor wouldn't be casually dismissed right away because of this small discourtesy, for which he would find an easy and suitable excuse later on. It seemed to Gregor that it might be far more reasonable to leave him in peace at the moment, instead of disturbing him with crying and conversation. But it was the very uncertainty which distressed the others and excused their behavior. Mr. Samsa, the manager was now shouting, his voice raised. What's the matter? You are barricading yourself in your room, answer with only a yes and a no, are making serious and unnecessary troubles for your parents and neglecting, I mention this only incidentally, your commercial duties in a truly unheard of manner. I'm speaking here in the name of your parents and your employer, and I am requesting you in all seriousness for an immediate and clear explanation. I am amazed. I am amazed. I thought I knew you as a calm, reasonable person, and now you appear suddenly to want to start parading around in weird moods. The chief indicated to me earlier this very day a possible explanation for your neglect. It concerned the collection of cash entrusted to you a short while ago. But in truth, I almost gave him my word of honor that this explanation could not be correct. However, now I see here your unimaginable pig-headedness, and I am totally losing any desire to speak up for you in the slightest. And your position is not at all the most secure. Originally, I intended to mention all this to you privately, but since you are letting me waste my time here uselessly, I don't know why the matter shouldn't come to the attention of your parents. Your productivity has also been very unsatisfactory recently. Of course, it's not the time of year to conduct exceptional business, we recognize that. But a time of year for conducting no business. There is no such thing at all, Mr. Samsa, and such a thing must never be. But Mr. Manager, called Gregor beside himself and in his agitation forgetting everything else. I'm opening the door immediately this very moment. A slight indisposition, a dizzy spell, has prevented me from getting up. I'm still lying in bed right now, but now I'm quite refreshed once again. I'm in the midst of getting out of bed. Just have patience for a short moment. Things are not going so well as I thought, but things are all right. How suddenly this can overcome someone. Just yesterday evening, everything was fine with me. My parents certainly know that. Actually, just yesterday evening, I had a small premonition. People must have seen that in me. Why have I not reported that to the office? But people always think that they'll get over sickness without having to stay at home. Mr. Manager, take it easy on my parents. There is really no basis for the criticisms which you are now making against me. And really nobody has said a word to me about that. Perhaps you have not read the latest orders which I shipped. Besides, now I'm setting out on my trip on the 8 o'clock train. The few hours' rest have made me stronger. Mr. Manager, do not stay. I will be at the office in person right away. Please have the goodness to say that and to convey my respects to the chief. While Gregor was quickly blurting all this out, hardly aware of what he was saying, he had moved close to the chest of drawers without effort, probably as a result of the practice he had already had in bed. And now he was trying to raise himself up on it. Actually, he wanted to open the door. He really wanted to let himself be seen by and to speak with the manager. He was keen to witness what the others now asking after him would say at the sight of him. If they were startled, then Gregor had no more responsibility and could be calm. But if they accepted everything quietly, then he would have no reason to get excited, and if he got a move on, could really be at the station around 8 o'clock. At first he slid down a few times from the smooth chest of drawers, but at last he gave himself a final swing and stood upright there. He was no longer at all aware of the pains in his lower body, no matter how they might still sting. Now he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair, on the edge of which he braced himself with his thin limbs. By doing this, he gained control over himself and kept quiet, for he could now hear the manager. "Did you understand a single word?" the manager asked the parents. "Is he playing the fool with us?" "For God's sake," cried the mother, already in tears. "Perhaps he's very ill and we're upsetting him. Greta, Greta," she yelled at that point. "Mother," called the sister from the other side. They were making themselves understood through Gregor's room. "You must go to the doctor right away. Gregor is sick. Hurry to the doctor. Have you heard Gregor speak yet?" "That was an animal's voice," said the manager, remarkably quietly in comparison to the mother's cries. "Anna! Anna!" yelled the father through the hall into the kitchen, clapping his hands. "Fetch a locksmith right away!" The two young women were already running through the hall with swishing skirts. How had his sister dressed herself so quickly? And yanked open the doors of the apartment. One couldn't hear the doors closing at all. They probably had left them open, as is customary in an apartment in which a huge misfortune has taken place. However, Gregor had become much calmer. All right, people did not understand his words anymore, although they seemed clear enough to him. Clearer than previously, perhaps because his ears had gotten used to them. But at least people now thought that things were not all right with him, and were prepared to help him. The confidence and assurance with which the first arrangements had been carried out made him feel good. He felt himself included once again in the circle of humanity, and was expecting from both the doctor and the locksmith, without differentiating between them with any real precision, splendid and surprising results. In order to get as clear a voice as possible for the critical conversation which was imminent, he coughed a little, and certainly took the trouble to do this in a really subdued way, since it was possible that even this noise sounded like something different from a human cough. He no longer trusted himself to decide anymore. Meanwhile, in the next room it had become really quiet. Perhaps his parents were sitting with the manager at the table and were whispering. Perhaps they were all leaning against the door and listening. Gregor pushed himself slowly towards the door with the help of the easy chair, let go of it there, threw himself against the door, held himself upright against it. The balls of his tiny limbs had a little sticky stuff on them, and rested there momentarily from his exertion. Then he made an effort to turn the key in the lock with his mouth. Unfortunately, it seemed that he had no real teeth. How then was he to grab hold of the key? But to make up for that, his jaws were naturally very strong. With their help, he managed to get the key really moving, and he did not notice that he was obviously inflicting some damage on himself, for a brown fluid came out of his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped onto the floor. "Just listen for a moment," said the manager in the next room. "He's turning the key." For Gregor, that was a great encouragement, but they all should have called out to him, including his father and mother. "Come on, Gregor," they should have shouted. "Keep going. Keep working on the lock." Imagining that all his efforts were being followed with suspense, he bit down frantically on the key with all the force he could muster. As the key turned more, he danced around the lock. Now he was holding himself upright only with his mouth, and he had to hang on to the key or then press it down again with the whole weight of his body as necessary. The quite distinct click of the lock as it finally snapped really woke Gregor up. Breathing heavily, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith," and he set his head against the door handle to open the door completely. Because he had to open the door in this way, it was already open very wide without him yet being really visible. He first had to turn himself slowly around the edge of the door, very carefully of course, if he did not want to fall awkwardly on his back right at the entrance into the room. He was still preoccupied with this difficult movement and had no time to pay attention to anything else. When he heard the manager exclaim aloud, "Oh!" It sounded like the wind whistling. And now he saw him, nearest to the door, pressing his hand against his open mouth and moving slowly back, as if an invisible constant force was pushing him away. His mother, in spite of the presence of the manager, she was standing here with her hair sticking up on end, still a mess from the night, with her hands clasped, was looking at his father. She then went 2 steps towards Gregor and collapsed right in the middle of her skirts, spreading out all around her, her face sunk on her breast, completely concealed. His father clenched his fist with a hostile expression, as if he wished to push Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and cried so that his mighty breast shook. At this point, Gregor did not take 1 step into the room, but leaned his body from the inside against the firmly bolted wing of the door, so that only half his body was visible, as well as his head, titled sideways, with which he peeped over at the others. Meanwhile, it had become much brighter. Standing out clearly from the other side of the street was a part of the endless grey-black house situated opposite. It was a hospital, with its severe regular windows breaking up the facade. The rain was still coming down, but only in large individual drops, visibly and firmly thrown down one by one onto the ground. The breakfast dishes were standing piled around on the table, because for his father, breakfast was the most important mealtime in the day, which he prolonged for hours by reading various newspapers. Directly across on the opposite wall hung a photograph of Gregor from the time of his military service. It was a picture of him as a lieutenant, as he, smiling and worry-free, with his hand on his sword, demanded respect for his bearing and uniform. The door to the hall was ajar, and since the door to the apartment was also open, one saw out into the landing of the apartment and the start of the staircase going down. "Now," said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one who had kept his composure. "I'll get dressed right away, pack up the collection of samples and set off. You'll allow me to set out on my way, will you not? You see, Mr. Manager, I am not pig-headed, and I am happy to work. Traveling is exhausting, but I couldn't live without it. Where are you going, Mr. Manager? To the office? Really? Will you report everything truthfully? A person can be incapable of work momentarily, but that is precisely the best time to remember the earlier achievements and to consider that later, after the obstacles have been shoved aside, the person will work all the more keenly and intensely. I'm really so indebted to Mr. Chief. You know that perfectly well. On the other hand, I am concerned about my parents and my sister. I'm in a fix, but I'll work myself out of it again. Don't make things more difficult for me than they already are. Speak up on my behalf in the office. People don't like traveling salesmen, I know that. People think they earn pots of money and thus lead a fine life. People don't even have any special reason to think through this judgment more clearly. But you, Mr. Manager, you have a better perspective on the interconnections than the other people. Even, I tell you in total confidence, a better perspective than Mr. Chairman himself, who in his capacity as the employer may let his judgment make casual mistakes at the expense of an employee. You also know well enough that the traveling salesman who is outside the office almost the entire year can become so easily a victim of gossip, coincidences, and groundless complaints, against which it's impossible for him to defend himself, since for the most part he doesn't hear about them at all, and only then when he's exhausted after finishing a trip, and gets to feel in his own body at home the nasty consequences which can't be thoroughly explored back to their origins. Mr. Manager, don't leave without speaking a word telling me that you'll at least concede that I'm a little in the right. But at Gregor's first words, the manager had already turned away, and now he looked back at Gregor over his twitching shoulders with pursed lips. During Gregor's speech, he was not still for a moment, but was moving away towards the door, without taking his eyes off Gregor, but really gradually, as if there was a secret ban on leaving the room. He was already in the hall, and after the sudden movement with which he finally pulled his foot out of the living room, one could have believed that he had just burned the sole of his foot. In the hall, however, he stretched out his right hand away from his body towards the staircase, as if some truly supernatural relief was waiting for him there. Gregor realized that he must not under any circumstances allow the manager to go away in this frame of mind, especially if his position in the firm was not to be placed in the greatest danger. His parents did not understand all this very well. Over the long years, they had developed the conviction that Gregor was set up for life in his firm, and in addition, they had so much to do nowadays with their present troubles that all foresight was foreign to them. But Gregor had this foresight. The manager must be held back, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family really depended on it. If only the sister had been there. She was clever. She had already cried while Gregor was still lying quietly on his back. And the manager, this friend of the ladies, would certainly let himself be guided by her. She would have closed the door to the apartment and talked him out of his fright in the hall. But the sister was not even there. Gregor must deal with it himself. Without thinking that as yet he didn't know anything about his present ability to move, and without thinking that his speech possibly, indeed probably, had once again not been understood, he left the wing of the door, pushed himself through the opening, and wanted to go over to the manager, who was already holding tight onto the handrail with both hands on the landing in a ridiculous way. But as he looked for something to hold on to, with a small scream, Gregor immediately fell down onto his numerous little legs. Scarcely had this happened when he felt for the first time that morning a general physical well-being. The small limbs had firm floor under them. They obeyed perfectly, as he noticed to his joy, and strove to carry him forward in the direction he wanted. Right away, he believed that the final amelioration of all his suffering was immediately at hand. But at the very moment when he lay on the floor, rocking in a restrained manner quite close and directly across from his mother, apparently totally sunk into herself, she suddenly sprang right up with her arms spread far apart, and her fingers extended and cried out, "Help! For God's sake, help!" She held her head bowed down, as if she wanted to view Gregor better, but ran senselessly back, contradicting that gesture, forgetting that behind her stood the table with all the dishes on it. When she reached the table, she sat down heavily on it, as if absent-mindedly, and did not appear to notice at all that next to her coffee was pouring out onto the carpet in a full stream from the large overturned container. "Mother, Mother," said Gregor quietly, and looked over towards her. The manager momentarily had disappeared completely from his mind. By contrast, at the sight of the flowing coffee, he couldn't stop himself snapping his jaws in the air a few times. At that, his mother screamed all over again, hurried from the table, and collapsed into the arms of his father, who was rushing towards her. But Gregor had no time right now for his parents. The manager was already on the staircase. His chin level with the banister, the manager looked back for the last time. Gregor took an initial movement to catch up to him if possible. But the manager must have suspected something, because he made a leap down over a few stairs and disappeared, still shouting, "Huh!" The sound echoed throughout the entire stairwell. Now, unfortunately, this flight of the manager also seemed completely to bewilder his father, who earlier had been relatively calm. For instead of running after the manager himself, or at least not hindering Gregor from his pursuit, with his right hand he grabbed hold of the manager's cane, which he had left behind with his hat and overcoat on a chair. With his left hand, his father picked up a large newspaper from the table and, stamping his feet on the floor, he set out to drive Gregor back into his room by waving the cane and the newspaper. No request of Gregor's was of any use. No request would even be understood. No matter how willing he was to turn his head respectfully, his father just stomped all the harder with his feet. Across the room from him, his mother had pulled open a window, in spite of the cool weather, and leaning out with her hands on her cheeks, she pushed her face far outside the window. Between the alley and the stairwell, a strong draft came up. The curtains on the window flew around. The newspapers on the table swished, and individual sheets fluttered down over the floor. The father relentlessly pressed forward, pushing out sibilants like a wild man. Now Gregor had no practice at all in going backwards. It was really going very slowly. If Gregor only had been allowed to turn himself around, he would have been in his room right away. But he was afraid to make his father impatient by the time-consuming process of turning around. And each moment he faced the threat of a mortal blow on his back or his head from the cane in his father's hand. Finally, Gregor had no other option, for he noticed with horror that he did not understand yet how to maintain his direction going backwards. And so he began, amid constantly anxious sideways glances in his father's direction, to turn himself around as quickly as possible, although in truth this was only very slowly. Perhaps his father noticed his good intentions, for he did not disrupt Gregor in this motion, but with the tip of the cane from a distance, he even directed here and there Gregor's rotating movement. If only there hadn't been his father's unbearable hissing. Because of that, Gregor totally lost his head. He was already almost totally turned around, when always with this hissing in his ear, he just made a mistake and turned himself back a little. But when he finally was successful in getting his head in front of the door opening, it became clear that his body was too wide to go through any further. Naturally, his father, in his present mental state, had no idea of opening the other wing of the door a bit to create a suitable passage for Gregor to get through. His single fixed thought was that Gregor must get into his room as quickly as possible. He would never have allowed the elaborate preparations that Gregor required to orient himself and thus perhaps get through the door. On the contrary, as if there were no obstacle and with a peculiar noise, he now drove Gregor forwards. Behind Gregor, the sound was at this point no longer like the voice of only a single father. Now it was really no longer a joke, and Gregor forced himself, come what might, into the door. One side of his body was lifted up. He lay at an angle in the door opening. His one flank was sore with the scraping. On the white door, ugly blotches were left. Soon he was stuck fast and would have not been able to move any more on his own. The tiny legs on one side hung twitching in the air above. The ones on the other side were pushed painfully into the floor. Then his father gave him one really strong, liberating push from behind, and he scurried, bleeding severely, far into the interior of his room. The door was slammed shut with the cane, and finally it was quiet. Chapter 2. Gregor first woke up from his heavy, swoon-like sleep in the evening twilight. He would certainly have woken up soon afterwards without any disturbance, for he felt himself sufficiently rested and wide awake, although it appeared to him as if a hurried step and a cautious closing of the door to the hall had aroused him. The shine of the electric streetlights lay pale here and there on the ceiling and on the higher parts of the furniture, but underneath around Gregor it was dark. He pushed himself slowly toward the door, still groping awkwardly with his feelers, which he now learned to value for the first time, to check what was happening there. His left side seemed one single long, unpleasantly stretched scar, and he really had to hobble on his 2 rows of legs. In addition, one small leg had been seriously wounded in the course of the morning incident. It was almost a miracle that only one had been hurt, and dragged lifelessly behind. By the door, he first noticed what had really lured him there. It was the smell of something to eat. For there stood a bowl filled with sweetened milk, in which swam tiny pieces of white bread. He almost laughed with joy, for he now had a much greater hunger than in the morning, and he immediately dipped his head almost up to and over his eyes down into the milk. But he soon drew it back again in disappointment, not just because it was difficult for him to eat on account of his delicate left side — he could eat only if his entire panting body worked in a coordinated way — but also because the milk, which otherwise was his favorite drink, and which his sister had certainly placed there for that reason, did not appeal to him at all. He turned away from the bowl almost with aversion and crept back into the middle of the room. In the living room, as Gregor saw through the crack in the door, the gas was lit. But where on other occasions at this time of day, the father was accustomed
Often alone, every first light of dawn, I've had to speak my sorrows. There's no one living to whom I would dare to reveal clearly my deepest thoughts. The weary mind cannot withstand weird fate. The troubled heart can offer no help. He who has come to know how cruel a companion is sorrow, to one who has few dear protectors, will understand this. The path of exile claims him, not patterned gold. A frost-bound spirit, not the solace of earth. He remembers hall holders and treasure-taking, how in his youth his gold-giving lord accustomed him to the feast. That joy all fades. When sorrow and sleep both together often bind up the wretched exile, it seems in his mind that he clasps and kisses his lord of men, and on his knee lays hands and head, as he sometimes long ago in earlier days enjoyed the gift throne. But when the friendless man awakens again and sees before him the fallow waves, seabirds bathing, spreading their feathers, frost falling and snow mingled with hail, then the heart's wounds are that much heavier, pain after pleasure. Where have the horses gone? Where are the riders? Where is the giver of gold? Where are the seats of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? How the time passed away, slipped into nightfall, as if it had never been. In the Old English poem The Wanderer, composed anonymously in the late 10th century, an exiled warrior mourns the death of his lord and kinsman. He wanders alone across the cold seas, winter sad and homesick, lamenting the destruction of his people and the passing of the joyful and youthful days once spent in the mead hall, a place that offered warmth, community, and belonging. The hall that once rang with merriment now lies silent. It is more than just a building. It stands as a symbol of the center of meaning, now left empty. The wanderer treads the path of exile, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, cut off from his homeland and kin. He reflects that no one can escape weird fate, or more accurately, that which comes to pass, which is inexorable. The archetype of the wanderer appears as a figure of profound loneliness, both outwardly and inwardly. His thoughts dwell on the good old days and the impermanence of worldly life, but he carries his pain silently, and despite his melancholy, he stresses the importance of wisdom and patience for endurance in the face of loss. Ultimately, he concludes that true stability is not found in the fleeting world, but in God. For everything passes, but God does not change. Wandering as a basic pattern of behavior goes back to our oldest ancestors, but when survival is sufficiently secured for the psyche to turn inward, the wanderer archetype is constellated, bringing something more existential and psychological than mere biological survival. Archetypes do not disappear, their form remains the same, but their content may shift, shaped by new conscious experiences. We evolved within small interdependent groups in which each person played a vital role in securing food and safety. Days were spent wandering, foraging, and hunting. Night was spent around the bonfire. The fire was not just essential for warmth, cooking, and protection. It was the gathering place for social and cultural life, the center of meaning. Here our ancestors shared food, planned for the coming day, and exchanged stories, dreams, and spiritual beliefs beneath the vast night sky, where the Milky Way and stars shone brightly, untouched by artificial light. Human genetic evolution has not kept pace with the rapid transformations of the modern era. Our biology remains fundamentally aligned with the simpler, more stable rhythms of hunter-gatherer life. Despite its hardships, it carried a profound sense of belonging. As social beings, we are wired to belong to communities where our contributions are recognized and valued. When that is lost, many sink into meaninglessness. Anthropologists have long known that when a tribe of people lose their feeling that their way of life is worthwhile, they may stop reproducing, or in large numbers simply lie down and die beside streams full of fish. Food is not the primary nourishment of man. The word wanderer comes from the Old English wanderian, which means to move about aimlessly. Such a person drifts through life without a fixed home or direction. restless in the search for purpose and belonging, often with the urge to pack a bag and simply leave to an unknown destination. In Japan, a samurai became a ronin, a wanderer, upon the death of his master. A samurai was expected to commit seppuku after such a loss, for his identity was tied to loyalty to a lord. Those who failed to follow the tradition were socially dishonored and marginalized. The ronin drifted from place to place. Some became mercenaries or rebels, while others managed to find a new master. In contemporary Japan, ronin is also used to describe students who have failed university entrance exams or unemployed individuals, reflecting the societal pressure and expectations surrounding academic and professional success. The term wanderlust, rooted in German Romanticism, conveys a light-hearted desire to wander. In contemporary German, however, the word Fernweh, far sickness, has become more common, carrying a melancholic undertone, a deep longing for distant places, and the hope of eventually finding a place on earth where one truly feels at home. Such people feel nostalgia of the good old days or the warmth of childhood, and sometimes experience an uncanny sense of déjà vu, as though certain moments have been lived before or new places already seen. The wanderer longs for home, yet feels at home nowhere, dwelling in a liminal space between past and present, the familiar and the unknown. He is in this world, but not of this world, echoing what Lovecraft wrote. I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and among those who are still men. In scripture, the archetype of the wanderer is reflected in Cain, who, jealous of God's favor towards Abel, commits the first murder and is cursed to be a restless wanderer, exiled to the land of Nod, whose name in Hebrew means to wander. In the 13th century, the legend of the eternally wandering Jew arose. As Christ carried the cross, a man mocked him, telling him to hurry. The unrecognized Savior turned and said, "I go, but you shall be waiting here for me when I return." If there's one key characteristic of the wanderer, it is restlessness, which appears as a constant need to chase the next thing, whether it be in the outer world, new places, careers, or relationships, or in the inner world, memories, dreams, and reflections. One is tired of living in the country, one moves to the city. One is tired of one's native land, one moves abroad. One is tired of Europe, one goes to America, and so on. Finally, one indulges in a dream of endless travel from star to star. All the movement is different but still in extension. One is tired of dining off porcelain, one dines of silver. One tires of that, one dines of gold. One burns half of Rome to get an idea of the conflagration at Troy. This method defeats itself. It is the bad infinite, endless progression. Once something is achieved, the wanderer is no longer satisfied and seeks something else, ad infinitum. This insatiable desire is the cause of much of our suffering. One could say that the wanderer cannot commit to anything, but he's certainly committed to wandering. The wanderer is always in search of something, but once he finds it, he quickly sets it aside and continues his restless pursuit. The outer wanderer is caught in a paradox. When he stops moving, he feels imprisoned. When he moves, he feels momentarily free. He's condemned to wander for the sake of wandering, yet unable to find rest without feeling trapped. This may lead him to embrace a kind of romantic fatalism, accepting his seemingly inescapable condition. We also wander within our own minds, conjuring imagined scenarios to escape reality, or become trapped in rumination, caught in a loop of negative emotions, past regrets, and perceived failures. In this way, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. The inner wanderer may daydream, watching an endless stream of fantasies unfold like a movie, while ignoring the emotions hidden within these inner images, emerging exhausted, drained, and unfulfilled. This is passive fantasy. The unconscious figures remain locked up, crying out for freedom, and one is unable to nourish the part of oneself that is starving. As Carl stated, we have been so busy with the question of what we think that we entirely forgot to ask what the unconscious psyche thinks about us. In contrast to passive fantasy, Active imagination allows the eye to fully enter into the unconscious, experiencing it with the same intensity and presence as one would in a physical, external situation. Here, the ego does not impose its own meaning, but instead surrenders to forces beyond its control, serving as an anchor between the outer and inner realms. Similarly, in meditation, one observes emotions without judgment, acknowledges them, and allows them to be integrated into consciousness. In this way, our inner figures are nourished and brought to life. Like a skilled sculptor who envisions the form hidden within a block of marble and carefully chisels away what is superfluous, freeing the figure from its prison. For Kierkegaard, the unreflective aesthete or pleasure seeker sees boredom as his worst enemy, the root of all evil. Strangely, those who don't bore themselves usually bore others, while those who do bore themselves amuse others. The people incapable of boredom are typically those who are busy in the world, but that is precisely why they are the most boring, the most insufferable of all. To wander without end is, eventually, to arrive at a dead end. The 2014 study, Just Think, The Challenges of the Disengaged Mind, found that people would rather administer electric shocks to themselves than spend 6 to 15 minutes alone in a room with nothing to do but think. As Milton writes, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And as Pascal famously stated, man's unhappiness comes from one single thing, not knowing how to stay quietly in a room. We often convince ourselves that boredom is bad, but the opposite is true. You need to be bored. When we are not focused on external tasks or goals and are left alone with our thoughts, the brain's default mode network lights up, and our minds begin to wander. We reflect on ourselves and on life, and begin to feel uneasy or think that something is wrong with us. But if we distract ourselves every time we feel even slightly bored, we make it harder to find meaning and stunt our creativity. Modern life is dominated by an unrelenting cycle of work and financial pressures, often sedentary and confined to a desk. In the few breaks we get, we instinctively reach for online content, numbing ourselves with short-term pleasures at the cost of long-term fulfillment. Too many drift into mediocrity, lost in distractions and shallow entertainment, until years pass and one realizes that nothing meaningful has been built. Despite constant connectivity through technology and social media, loneliness has increased. Superficial interactions and the lack of genuine belonging leave many feeling isolated. We compare ourselves to the highlights of others' lives, mistake them for the whole truth, and grow increasingly alienated, creating unrealistic expectations for our ideal self, while despising our real self. To fill this inner void, some become digital wanderers, creating online personas and seeking attention. In real life, they may go unnoticed, but online they can appear as heroes until they return to daily life when reality feels dull by comparison. Others become anonymous internet trolls, posting deliberately offensive or provocative messages to elicit strong emotional responses. Like Dostoevsky's underground men, they are alienated, resentful, and rebellious, attempting to assert control or influence in a world they feel powerless. Silence and stillness make us uneasy, so we reach for more noise, more stimulation. We feel a constant need to kill time, treating it as an enemy in our pursuit of progress. But this only brings more suffering, more stress, shorter attention spans, poor sleep, and heightened anxiety and depression. Many endure unpleasant states of mind by distracting themselves, even if it means living in misery most of the time. When one steps back and looks at life, it almost seems like a grand, tragic joke. Always running, running, running. What are you running for? Or better yet, what are you running from? Is it not, perhaps, yourself? Until one honestly confronts oneself, life, as Schopenhauer writes, swings like a pendulum backward and forward, between pain and ennui. Ennui is a deeper, more existential form of boredom, encompassing a profound dissatisfaction and weariness with life. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are 6 realms into which consciousness can enter during the bardo, the liminal state between death and rebirth. These realms are part of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and reflect the karma and mental patterns we carry through life, shaped by our experiences and attachments. The wondrous insatiable desire can be compared to the realm of hungry ghosts, where one experiences both poverty and fullness at the same time. Whatever you want, you do not have to look for, but you find yourself possessing it. Yet this makes us more deprived, because we get satisfaction not from possessing alone, but from searching. There's a fundamental insatiable hunger based on the realization that we already have everything we desire, yet we cannot enjoy it. Once you hold what you desire, the joy of having it fades, yet you cannot bring yourself to let it go. It is as though you are completely full, but you love to eat, and so you begin to have hallucinations of the flavor of food and the pleasure of eating it, tasting it, chewing it, swallowing it, and digesting it. The whole process seems luxurious, and you feel extremely envious of other people who can really be hungry and eat. This is symbolized by the image of a person with a gigantic belly and extremely thin neck and tiny mouth. In Dante's Inferno, after passing the gate of hell, which bears the inscription, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter," one first encounters the vestibule of hell. Here dwell the neutrals or opportunists, lukewarm souls who took no sides in life, neither good nor evil, concerned only with themselves. Guilty of moral indecision, they endure a punishment that mirrors their wasted lives, endlessly pursuing a shifting banner, a restless futility that reflects their spiritual stagnation. By contrast, Limbo, the first circle of hell, is home to the virtuous but unredeemed. These souls endure no physical torment, yet wander without hope, in perpetual longing, eternally separated from God. Colloquially, we say we are in a limbo when we are unsure what to do next, caught in a liminal state which is neither here nor there. Perhaps you have finished a project, but the next step is unclear, or you have lost your job, and the future feels uncertain, or you have ended a relationship, and you do not know what comes next. It is as if life has paused, and you're waiting for something to happen, but it hasn't yet. One experiences simultaneously stagnation, but also anxiety about what the future might bring. The wanderer's quest begins with a deep yearning, driven by existential angst and the desire to make sense of one's life, as if one lacks something eternally firm within oneself. Often we do not even have a name for what is missing, but we long for that mysterious something. Fate leads the willing and drags along the reluctant. Each must fulfill the purpose for which one was born, willy-nilly, and that is unique to each individual. What seems meaningless to one may be meaningful to another. There's no recipe for living that suits all cases. Perhaps one longs to discover one's meaning, but cannot, even after years or decades of wandering. The pain may become so great that one convinces oneself that life is meaningless, simply to...
Unstable. Too much step. Tried switching to reserve band. No dice. Guess it's a relay problem. Reach the relay and investigate. I repeat, reach the relay and investigate. Move fast before it cuts completely. Do you read? got worried for a hot minute there. So, I've been going through the list of damaged facilities, and you know what? It's one heck of a long list. And our list of assets is short. And by short, I mean it's just little old you. I'm sending you the to-do list now. That should keep you busy. Our relay can't do much without fuel, unfortunately. So, here's the plan. Deliver the semi-truck from the gas station to the relay. I hear no objections, so I consider the motion passed. substation and restoring the electricity supply would be a huge help. After all, you can't really do much without juice. But it's going to take some driving. This time, I'll ask you to take the truck loaded with steel beams from the relays yard to the power substation. For sure you can handle it. But please exercise a little caution. If the truck turns over, you'll be in a lot of trouble and a long way from help. By the by, we had a driver up and quit on us. Just not cut out for the job, I guess. Only 18 hours behind the wheel was enough to send him running. Didn't even deliver the truck of steel beams all the way. Left it next to the town church. Could you bring the truck to the garage? Would be a great help. And net you a nice bonus. Okay, the factory looks good to go for now. Once, it has power. I'm sure you understand what needs to be done. But if we're doing it by the book, restore the power supply to the factory according to regulatory blah blah blah. You get the picture. So, here's the gist. Lay a cable from the power substation to the factory. And please don't get electrocuted. I don't need that on my report. Or my conscience.
mathematical principle.
Let's start off very baseline. Can you explain to the layman how we don't see reality as it is?
Right, so most of us assume that what you see is what you get. I see a car, that's because there really is a car there. I see the moon, that's because the moon really is there, and so forth. And we assume, those who know evolutionary theory, for example, might say, well, and the reason we know that we see the truth is because we evolved to be fit. And to be fit, you should see the truth, right? The more accurate your perceptions are, the better you should see the truth about reality. And those who think that this isn't reality, if you don't think that car is real, if you step in front of it, you'll find out that it is real, that it can hurt you. So those are the kinds of intuitions that we all have. And it just turns out when you look at evolutionary theory carefully. So Darwin didn't have mathematics. He gave a beautiful theory, but there wasn't any mathematics. But John Maynard Smith in 1970 and so now we can take up Darwin's ideas and look at mathematical theorems about what's entailed by his theory. And you can ask the question, what is the probability that organisms are shaped by evolution to see aspects of reality as it is, truthfully? And the bottom line is the probability is zero. That's the bottom line. When you do the math, the probability is zero. And the reason is slightly technical, but not too hard. And that is, there's something called the fitness functions, right? They describe for a given organism, if you take this action and you're in this state, what the consequences, the fitness consequences will be for you. And by fitness, evolutionary theory, of course, means the chances of successfully reproducing. So that's the measure of fitness that we're talking about, the probability of reproducing successfully. So when you look at these fitness payoff functions, since they're what's shaping the sensory systems of the organism, right? That's what's shaping evolution in evolutionary theory, these fitness payoff functions. You depend on the state of the world, the organism, its actions, and you get a payoff. Like, for example, just to be very concrete, if I'm a human being and I'm standing in the middle of the 405 freeway at 10 o'clock in the morning, that's a bad place to be, and my fitness payoff is death, right? That's really a dumb thing to do. So, whereas, so you can see, you take an organism, put it in a place, put it in an action, and then you get a number, the thumbs up or thumbs down for your fitness payoffs. So these are functions, and for those who know some mathematics, they are just functions. And it turns out there's no constraint on these functions in evolutionary theory. There's no constraint that says they only have to be continuous, or they have to be quadratic. There's just no constraint in the theory. So Darwin's theory doesn't tell us these are the kinds of functions. So given that, we ask what is the probability? We can just look at the space of all possible fitness payoff functions and ask how many of them will shape organisms to perceive aspects of reality. Very, very, you can just assess it with mathematics. And it turns out 0%. Zero, it doesn't mean none, but it means 0%. So if you're a betting person, the good bet is against seeing the truth. Now, someone can come back and say, well, I don't like that. I mean, and a lot of people do. They come back and say, I don't like that. And my attitude is perfectly fine. I have no skin in the game. I don't care. I'm just telling you what the current theory says. The current theory says all fitness payoff functions are equally likely. And I say, okay, they're all equally likely, then the probability that you see the truth is zero. Now, someone can come along and say, well, then I'll show you why they're not all equally likely. Perfectly fine with me. Go ahead and do that. But I haven't seen anybody do that. But that is the right response to my... Now here's a response that I think a lot that is, I think, a mistaken response. The response is, look, Darwin started his theory with physical organisms competing in space and time for physical resources, mates and food and so forth. And now you're saying you're using Darwin's theory, a mathematical version, to prove that the probability that space and time and organisms and food and so forth are almost surely not the nature of reality. So Hoffman, you should go learn some logic. You started with the assumption of space and time and physical objects and payoffs, fitness payoffs for food and so forth. And now you're saying that that physical stuff is not the nature of reality. You've shot yourself in the foot logically. So go back and learn some logic. And this is actually, this is not just informal. There are philosophers who published papers on this where they, in prestigious journals, where they make exactly this kind of argument that I've caught myself in a logical bind. And so this raises an important point about science. And it's very elementary. Scientific theories start with assumptions. Like Einstein, the special theory of relativity. He started with the assumption that the speed of light is the same in all inertial frames, and that there is no special inertial frame. The laws of physics are the same in all inertial frames. And he said, if you grant me those two assumptions, then he could build actually relativistic space-time with all the changing clocks and meter stick lengths and the whole bit came from those assumptions. But he didn't explain the assumptions. He assumed those assumptions. And actually, toward the end of his life, Einstein said, I still don't know what light is. I've spent my life thinking about light and working on light, and I don't know. So he doesn't know why the speed of light is the same in all inertial frames, or why all inertial frames have the same laws of physics. But those are his assumptions. And this is true of any scientific theory.
And when you say that, by the way, you just mean the speed limit on the universe, essentially.
Right. Nothing can go faster than the speed of light.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and he didn't want to spend most of his life figuring out why, but just kind of went with that assumption.
Oh, I think Einstein wondered a lot about why.
Yeah,
but he couldn't answer the question. If you assume it, then you get the structure of what we call Minkowski space coming out of it. And of course, I think you can, with any scientific theory, you can say, I'll give you a new set of assumptions that are deeper, and from my new set of assumptions, I'll explain your previous assumptions. But here's the key point. No scientific theory can ever be a theory of everything. Period. Anybody who doesn't have a wink and a nod when they talk about their theory of everything is missing the point. I think a lot of brilliant physicists who talk about a theory of everything know that they're not talking about a theory of everything, but they really just mean the unification of certain theories that are not unified now. But there are a lot of people who think that we could get a theory of everything, and I'm saying no, never. Even if we worked for 1 billion years and had 1 billion Einsteins working for 1 billion years, we would never have the theory of everything. We'd get 0% of reality. And the reason is every theory starts with assumptions, and it doesn't explain its assumptions. It assumes them. And therefore, every theory has two properties. If it's a good theory, it has a scope of explanation. So there is a scope of things that it can explain. By the way, most theories don't. Most theories, and I get them in emails a lot, most theories have no scope whatsoever. There's nothing there. But a good theory has a scope, but it's a limited scope. It's not everything. It's not a theory of everything. And then, so they have a scope, and they can tell you, if it's a good theory, they'll give you mathematics to explore that scope. But if it's a great theory, not just a good theory, but a great theory, it will give you the tools to figure out the limits of explanation that were entailed by the very assumptions that started the theory. Because a theory must start with assumptions, it has limited scope. The only question is, does the theory itself give you the tools, is it a great theory, to give you the tools to find that necessary limit or not? And what I'm saying is, Darwin's theory, with John Maynard Smith's mathematics of evolutionary game theory, is a great theory. We knew up front that it couldn't be the final theory of everything, And it turns out to have the tools to say that its very foundational assumptions, of course, are not the final truth. But we knew that. That's true for any scientific theory. You give me a scientific theory, tell me its assumptions, and I will tell you something that's not the final truth. Those assumptions. So, a theory that gives you assumptions that lets you come back and tell you that those assumptions aren't the final word on truth is a great theory, and those are the theories that we look for. So it's for those who have said that I'm shooting myself in the foot, they completely misunderstand the foundations of science itself and the scientific enterprise. It's not the false interpretation is science is the crawling towards the ultimate truth, and we're going to get there. Maybe, who knows? Maybe this century we'll get there. That's just false. The right approach, or I'll put it this way, a deeper approach to understanding science, is to note that every scientific theory starts with its own assumptions, and therefore it has limited scope of explanation. And if it's a great theory, it will use its own assumptions to show the limits of those assumptions and to show that they can't be the final. But most theories aren't that good. I mean, Einstein's theory, it's Einstein's theory, I must say, together with quantum mechanics. So quantum field theory together with which brings together quantum mechanics and Einstein theory, and also general relativity. Together, that package tells us that space-time cannot be fundamental. So that's in the physics side. And in Darwin's theory by itself agrees that physical objects in space-time can't be fundamental. So here we have quantum field theory and evolutionary theory telling us that space-time and its objects are not fundamental. Now, we already knew that none of our assumptions are fundamental. It's just great to have these theories being so powerful that they're telling us that these assumptions are not fundamental. So that's the fundamental orientation that people need to have about this thing. It's not about shooting yourself in the foot. No theory has the final assumptions. Some theories are so deep that their assumptions tell you that the assumptions aren't true. They're not the final word. But most theories aren't that good.
We're gonna keep diving into all of that. But to keep making our way through this in a digestible manner, I'm curious because when you speak to how the likelihood that evolution has shaped sensory systems to, see objective reality is effectively zero, and perception is reality in so many ways. As human beings, we kind of share generally a similar sense through our sense perceptions, sense organs, this experience of life. And it seems like we see reality as it is because it's ubiquitous within our experience, it's all we've known. And yet I think what's helpful in seeing and breaking down this notion of it being connected to what reality actually is seeing the variance in how perception occurs within all life. So I'm curious, what comes to mind when you think about all the different life forms and animals and their sense organs and how they perceive reality, where if you put them side by side to us, our experience of life is completely different, and yet we both feel like it's the way reality is to us, because it is for us.
Well, that's a great question, and there's a lot to say on that. But one thing I'll start with is to point out that I actually don't know what your perceptions are like.
Right.
I
can assume
that I pick up this cup and I say, yeah, it's sort of a cup that's got some bends in it and it's got some tea in it, and you would agree, but I have no idea what your experience is. I assume that it's very much like mine, and part of this is because we learn to talk by something called ostensive definition. So if you're a child, and your mom or your dad is there and you're like 18 months old and it's time for you to learn some words. And there's a rabbit on the floor. And mom or dad points and says rabbit. And if the child's at the right age, they get it. You only have to point once or twice and say rabbit. But if the child, if you did it when they were 6 months old, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And if you do it with a rat, it doesn't work. If you take a rat and point to a rabbit and say rabbit, it doesn't work. Why does it work with the child? Well, the child already had its own experience and conceptualization, so to speak, the organization of it as a rabbit. And so all you do as a parent is you give the words for the experience that the child already has. You're not giving the experiences. The child's experience is whatever it is. How can you ever know? For all I know, your world could be utterly different in conscious experiences. Now, you, of course, you have some empirical evidence for this.
But it is also just important to highlight that even within the spectrum of human experience, there is variance that we do know of, and there's also a lot of variance that we don't know of that we just assume that is the same.
That's right. So in color, we assume that I talk about the green plants here, and a little bit of red in the carpet and so forth. And I assume that your experience of red and green and so forth is very, very similar to mine. But there are women called tetrafems who have 4 color photoreceptors instead of 3. Most of us have just short, medium, and long wavelength photoreceptors, and these women have 4 instead of just 3. And they're called tetrafems. And I'm actually friends with someone who's done research on this, Kimberly Lenson and others who have done research on this. And they can do genetic tests, and they find these women that have the gene for being tetraphobe, and put them in psychophysical experiments where you test their color discriminations, and they're finer than ours. They actually have different color boundaries and finer discriminations. They can see, maybe an order of magnitude more colors than we do. So we already have empirical evidence. But again, we don't know what it's like to be a tetraphobe. I don't know what it's like. No guy could ever know, and most women could never know. But even if you're a trichromatic just like me, the fact is I have no idea what your experience is like. I assume, and I'm not saying it's a bad assumption. If I had to bet, I would say there's no reason for me to disbelieve. But I just want to point out that it's a belief. It's not a proven fact. It's a belief that your perceptions are similar to mine. Here's a fun technological thing that someone could do. I think that we could write a multi-person AI first-person game where people around the world could be, put on a headset, be immersed in a game that they're all playing internationally. But each headset is actually a very, very different looking game. But there's a translation, so maybe I'm playing tennis in this one, and you're playing badminton in that one, and someone else is playing, Grand Theft Auto over there. And we're all playing together. Even though you're playing Grand Theft Auto, I think you're playing tennis with me. And I think that you could actually coordinate that such that I'm playing and we're all interacting, but then when you change headsets, you go, holy smoke, you were playing a completely different game than I thought you were playing. And I think that would be fun to do to really shake people up and show that the assumption, now again, I'm not claiming that we're not seeing the same game, but I'm saying it would be fun to shake up the assumption that we are by putting together a multiplayer VR situation where as you change, like a dozen different headsets, and every one of them is a different world, and you're doing something entirely different in the world, and yet they're all coordinated. So I think that's eminently possible, and that would really go a long way to shaking people up. And again, for all I know, your experiences are very much like mine.
Yeah, but it is interesting how we are really only always speaking in approximations, and language is always going to be futile, and it helps us kind of speak about reality in a sort of agreed upon shared sense that is a lie fundamentally, but we can just kind of approximate what we perceive on the less than 1% available to us on the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yes.
But we know that before we even get into different animals and what their experience is like, that depending on the state of consciousness that we're in, and we could very subtly tweak our biochemistry exogenously, endogenously, psychedelics, many different things.
Right.
And the experience of reality changes so drastically by very minor changes. So it's just, yeah, fascinating.
Little DMT and you're in a different world.
Yeah.
Completely different world. And then for a lot of people, then shakes up very much the assumption that what I'm seeing is reality. I haven't done it.
Yeah.
But lots of people contact me and say, I have done it, and I like your theory because when I go on the DMT, it says you're... And so I didn't come up with a theory because of DMT, but I get people with DMT saying this really works.
I've seen a lot of comments on previous episodes of both the ones we've done and others where people who have explored psychedelics or DMT, for example, have really resonated because there is this fundamental, I guess, effect of your work, which is shaking up our notion of preconceived notions of reality. And so yeah, let's keep going. So what are some other examples of life that has different access to different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum with their own sense organs that you find interesting?
Right, so some birds can see the polarization of light and use it to navigate. I can't see the polarization of light. I don't know what it would be like to experience the polarization of light. You can get a little sense of it if you wear sunglasses, right? And things look darker when you look over there and a little bit brighter when you look over there. So you can get some sense of it, but we're not actually built with polarization. There are all sorts of, there are animals that see frequencies of light that we can't see, ultraviolet, infrared. It's truly stunning, the range of other experiences. There are some that can experience electric fields, so they actually have electroreceptors, and they actually use it I guess in water, in sharks and so forth. I'm not sure about sharks, but certain animals can use electric fields to detect prey and capture, right? And again, I have no idea what it would be like to have an electric field around me and using that to detect prey. There are some wonderful books out there about just how different the animal senses are, so it's easy to find books.
All right, so reality is not the way that we perceive it. I think we can all agree upon that. And so then walk us through a little bit closer now to your understanding of sort of space-time being a headset. How do you bridge us into the deeper implications of your work, exploring consciousness and, when you say space-time, just like a headset that we're wearing, just like when you're playing Grand Theft Auto, it seems like this reality, and if you have a VR headset that you're playing, it seems like the reality that you're immersed in because you're so plugged into it, and it's so enchanting in your experience of it. But if perception is not objective reality, then what is perception?
Right, so if we can go back to evolutionary theory on this, right? So if I'm saying Darwin's theory entails not that we see objective reality, but it's shaping us to be fed, what does that mean? I mean, most of it thinks, well, the only way you could be fed is to see reality. And these virtual reality games give them a different idea about it. If you're playing Grand Theft Auto VR, then what you're really interacting with in this situation are millions of diodes and resistors and voltages in some supercomputer somewhere. And in principle, you could play the game by toggling millions of voltages per second in exactly the right sequence. You have to be really, really good. There would be millions of voltages per second. It have to be exactly the right sequence. Everybody who's programmed, you get one bit wrong and the whole thing falls apart. So you could do that. But you would lose if you tried to, even if you wrote the program, you would lose if you were trying to toggle all those bits one by one against someone who had just a VR headset and had a steering wheel, a virtual steering wheel, and was trying to play the game that way. And so the person with the headset, with the VR headset, is going to be more fit, more likely to win at playing the game of Grand Theft Auto than the person who sees the reality and can toggle the bits. And so that's the notion of fitness that comes out of Darwin. You don't see the truth I think the reason is because it's infinitely complicated. Reality, whatever it is infinitely complicated. There's no way, period, to understand. So it's just off the table.
It would defeat the purpose of having an experience that allows us to effectively navigate anything.
That's right. So so reality is what it is, and it's infinitely complicated. We have a little trivial three-dimensional space, one-dimensional time headset that takes this infinity of complexity and puts it down into what looks to us like a complicated world, but it's 0% of the complexity of reality, 0%. And that's what Darwin's theory is telling us, is this is a headset that is there to keep you alive in this particular context. Being a human being, reproducing, having a job, whatever. In that game, you're an elephant, it's a different game. You're a worm, it's a different headset. But space-time and not final ground thing. It's trivial. It's trivial compared to this. And I shouldn't say that we should go to the experts. Those experts are so-called high-energy theoretical physicists. That's the right group of scientists. What do they say? Do they come along and say, no, Darwin was wrong, space-time is fundamental, and get used to it, Darwin was just wrong? No, they don't say that at all. They say, and I'm saying Nima Khan-Ahmed, David Gross, and others say space-time is doomed. By that they mean it's not fundamental. It falls apart. 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. It ceases to have any operation. And so physicists, again, high-energy theoretical physicists. So when I say physicists, I'm short for high-energy theoretical physicists in this context. So these physicists are saying that space-time is not fundamental, and we have to look for a deeper mathematical framework entirely outside of space. And that's not just a distant wish. They're doing it now. The European Research Council has a 10 million euro enterprise funding roughly dozens or even 100 physicists and mathematicians who are finding what they call positive geometries outside of space-time. It's really quite exciting. They're finding these,
like the amplitude-hedron, or is that?
Yeah, the amplitude-hedron is one of them. The cosmological polytope, associahedron, and other structures. So they're finding these almost like these monoliths outside of space-time. These big structures, complicated geometric structures, and they allow you to actually predict correctly the probabilities of interactions. This is called scattering amplitudes for interactions of particles in space-time. So they know they're onto something, and the math is much easier. What would take millions of terms to compute within space-time, like some gluons and photons and whatever, and quarks interacting, they can do much more simply outside of space-time.
Is it a rudimentary understanding to say, like, you wouldn't expect to go into a vacant field where no one has been and there's no form of intelligence and see a Taj Mahal structure there, for example? That would denote